go. Let's have a look back at what we just looked at there. Is looking at modules. I'm going to put on my calm, reassuring voice. I just, whilst you were away, re-uploaded the module because one of the readings from it was slightly off-center, and so you couldn't see the entire text. So I'm now going to be working from that I've got open. I also very quickly popped into ye olde YouTube and produced the opening scenes to The Hunger Games, the first film, The Giver, and Ready Player One. So those are going to be there for use because you've now got the opening text from like the opening scene of the book, and you've got the opening scene of the film as well, open for a comparison. Okay. But in part one, we started looking at genre conventions of science fiction. We talked about setting, time and place as being a very strong element. I talked about outer space, being lost in space, and outer space as a means to investigating inner space. Then we talked about the kind of fantasy where firstly we stay on Earth and we explore utopian, dystopian societies, future Earth societies, generally as an invitation to compare to our own contemporary societies. Certainly as a very effective technique for exploring our relationships with technology, for example, and our current societal norms, and time travel as well. Particularly, these two are sort of time-based future Earth societies. So you're not actually going anywhere. There's no voyage, or the voyage is one through time. We then talked about characters, and what was particularly new to this genre, though not that far away from the monsters of Gothic and fantasy, is the meeting with the other, an otherness that is both aliens and robots and cyborgs. And aliens generally present very similar opportunities to monsters. The question being in the end is, who is the monster? What does it mean to be human? Robots and cyborgs particularly investigate this idea of humanity, and then on top of that, this idea of artificial intelligence and what is sentience. So they kind of sort of examine the very things that we tend to assume make us different, things like sentience, awareness of our own death, and language, which are all things that robots and cyborgs take on board from us. A lot of science fiction fits into Bildungsroman, the sort of coming of age, rites of passage. That says maturation plot. I just looked at that and thought it said something different and got slightly concerned. And I think if we look at our given fiction here, they're all Bildungsroman to a certain degree. They're a journey through young life and a confronting of normally quite a singular conflict. They give very strong ideas of time and place. You can even think of, the space opera tradition, which is the sort of American filmatic tradition of, sort of action adventure in space, starting really mostly with Star Wars. You can think of Luke. Not only is he a potential Cinderella rags to riches type story, he's definitely a sort of coming of age story there as well. And the Hunger Games, The Giver, Wade Wyatt as well in Ready Player One, they all follow a similar kind of plot pattern that we can see there in the sort of rites of passage. The dramatic plot that we discussed earlier this morning, the typical setting, conflict, rising action to a climactic turning point, whether there's one or maybe a false one and sort of anticlimax and then a climax with a denouement, certainly fits a sort of action adventure type film, and sometimes that is problematic. That may be what we can experience with, for example, Ready Player One, that what is a far more thoughtful book is then shoehorned into a sort of Hollywood adventure drama that doesn't really fit it. But Star Wars would definitely fit this. Tightly plotted, everything plays into the final closed structure. If there's an open-ended element, it's purely a plot device to carry on into a next episode. So they're highly plotted um, uh, dramas. Though that fits the space opera, particularly thinking about it, doesn't necessarily fit the Lost in Space type dramas. Certainly doesn't fit or necessarily has to fit dystopian, utopian fiction and time travel. Time travel, now that I mention it, gives unique opportunities, obviously, for multiple and parallel plot lines, and in media res, in the midst, in the middle of things, flashback plots as well, where different timelines converge or work against each other. I've already mentioned Planet of the Apes as having the incredible twist, of course, of Earth being outer space. And we can think about the work of Christopher Nolan, Inception, Interstellar, as being very strong in exploring these opportunities. Another plot and perspective that could be quite different is the first person narrative, which we've mentioned before, that it wasn't really the familiar narrative style of fantasy or gothic potentially. However, here, unless you're having this sort of frame narrative where somebody tells their story, the Hunger Games is interesting in the fact that it's a first person narrative in the present tense, which is something you can potentially explore and then see when you look at the film version of it, how it's replotted and reperspectivized in order to make it more accessible to a wider audience. So, subject and theme, which is something I'm going to work on explicitly in our next session with Animal Stories. I'm going to look at how to express subject and theme. And I know some of you doing 504 might have done a bit of work on it already. It's an important essence of what is a subject, what is a theme. And I'm going to deal with it particularly in a literature context, because often you'll see theme expressed as love or war, and that's not a theme, that's a subject. You can look at it and describe it. Love is not a theme all on its own. But let's have a look at some of the things that they can be about and what they might then say about those things. Subject is what something is about. Theme is what the work says about the subject. Future societies, utopian and dystopian. These are things you'll be discussing in section 2 at length. You may be presented with a future society as a subject, and that is what we're looking at and exploring. But obviously, thematically, what they tend to do is explore issues of contemporary society, looking at its difference, and through difference, it might make our norms more apparent, seem ridiculous. Rather like Gulliver's Travels, for those of you who know that. This same kind of fantastic voyage to a different world, almost like a portal quest in fantasy, presents us with a world where they do ridiculous things, but they turn out to be just as arbitrary as what we do in our own society. So utopian and dystopian fiction is a great way of exploring our own societies and understanding it from a new perspective and seeing it as quite arbitrary, quite random. Outer space and the castaway narrative. Moon, another good example. Planet of the Apes, very good example. There are countless examples. So they use this sort of Crusoe myth to explore inner space. They tend to make the individual human subject confront their own existence and question everything about either their former existence or the society that they belong to, or a conflict with their own beliefs or with nature. I had a conflict slide which seemed to have slipped out this morning as well, because often the protagonist and in our plot setup we see you have this sort of conflict that's set up. Time travel, similarly, by being in different times, it really tends to thematically, though that's our subject, might be time travel, it seems to really explore themes of why, or this sort of relativism of our own time, basically. It's used to explore what we do in our own time and how it could be completely random and very subjective and highly contextualized. Similarly, time, place, society, they all are used in turn as a conflict to then question our own society and the aliens, robots, and cyborgs uh, as subjects invite themes of what it means to be human, what it means to be not human, what humanness means in the broader context of the universe. So we can see that this sort of this thematic material, which is very strong, um, would essentially probably come from golem stories and Frankenstein, man-made monsters, are the robots and the cyborgs, and then of course the aliens are the classic monsters, the other, that we meet in the world around us and force us to look back at ourselves. So there's strong universal themes in science fiction that explore the individual and human subject, um, society, nature, and the human's place in nature. So these are strong conflicts and thematically universal themes that rely on particular ideas of illusion, symbolism, and allegory. Now, we already went in and we looked at imagery when we did description, both characterization and setting. And I talked about literal language, which you can see there in the slide. I don't think I need to go through that again. And then figurative language with ideas of anthropomorphism and personification, which were quite strong, obviously, in science fiction. But this idea of substitution of metaphor then tends to broaden out to a whole new level and is easy to look at in terms of science fiction, where um, uh, by a subject of being in a society which is not our own society, um, the the text seems to allude to something outside of the text, which is what allusion says here, understood by the intended reader, who is yours truly. And so when you go into the future, seemingly utopian but predictably dystopian society of the giver, that what that it refers to, that it alludes to, is your own society and makes you question your own values. So illusion is very strong in all of our books, in that they sort of seem to look back to our own society. One of the books that's particularly strong on symbolism or illusion through symbolism is The Hunger Games, which even starts off with its own intertextual reference, I feel, with the Mockingjay there on the cover, which seems to refer back to another great work of American fiction, To Kill a Mockingbird. And this is an allusion that we, outside the text, can understand. It's a symbol within the text that represents the struggle and resistance, and maybe that part of it might not be understood by the external reader. But what we do understand with the Mockingjay is that it's a sort of an engineered species and bird, but it also seems to intertextually refer To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a bird that mimics others, just like the Mockingjay in Hunger Games. So we've got a very strong sense of both illusion and symbolism. There's the potential for allegory as well, which is the third level, from illusion referring to something outside the text that you understand. Symbolism normally represents something within the textual world. Allegory is a text-wide level of symbolism that the reader could potentially understand. So when you look at Panem, for example, just to pick out one example in the Hunger Games and the 13 districts, its potential to see that as allegorically a system of symbolism that represents the 13 colonies of Britain in the Americas. However, do we actually understand that as a full level of allegory? Is it a one-for-one correspondence? And the answer is probably not. However, it's something outside the text that would potentially be understood by an intended reader. So there's a significance there, meaning. So we'd probably see that as a kind of an allusion to our colonial past in this dystopian future. I should set you up for your final task for today then. Let's have a look at the readings. What I've given you to do this afternoon, I've kind of added in a bit of filmatic input as well, because I think it gives you the potentiality to look at the text and to look at the film at the same time. So under readings, I put in what I've called context questions. In each case, as you look at a text, you can ask, what is utopian, dystopian fiction? What is illusion, symbolism, and allegory? And then relate these terms to the subjects and themes that you might have identified in the science fiction that you're looking at. In what sense can we identify, for example, the future society and the giver as utopian or dystopian, and how then does that relate to us? Is it an allusion to our society, or is it fully allegorical? Is it a one-for-one representation of our society? Other questions is, how does an explore science fiction differ from fantasy? I've kind of pointed to some of the ideas, but there's a great deal of similarities. But see if you can find examples of that in what you've got, both in your visual filmatic material and in the opening text. And obviously, with its clear conflicts of individuals, society, and nature, there are particular opportunities, both history, geography, social sciences, religion, and ethics, for cross-curricular learning in science fiction. So that's a final question: is what opportunities do you see in these texts? So what I've included in the PDF for you is the first couple of pages from the Hunger Games here. Interesting to see how it works. Inaptly snapped by me down there. It's a lovely thumb with lots of dirt under the nail. That's me. Here are the first couple of pages of Ready Player One. Quite different again. I know quite a few of you said, "Oh my God, the film and the book. What did they do?" They certainly tried to potentially turn it into something different. You can probably read up until there if you want to have a look at how it's introduced and the voice and the plot and perspective of Ready Player One contra the film. And I didn't have the giver right here. I've actually just been looking at online versions. Something really interesting is going on for me in this very first section of the giver, which is not there at all in the film. The film, to me, it's quite interesting. If you want to watch the film, you could even watch the beginning to the Hunger Games and see how it sort of uses the same trope that's in the giver as well. However, there's a duality of third person narration, which seems to have a voice and a narrator. It's unclear whether it's an internal or external narrator, or what's exactly going on. So it may well be worth looking at there. Jonas there refers to himself in the third person at the beginning of that, which is an interesting little device. And you could be able to match that and look at the completely different introduction to the film there as well. So YouTubers, off you go. You can complete task 2 at home. So I'm going to say goodbye from me for now for this short session. That's just